Well, and welcome to What's the Scoop, episode number 11. Wow. Um, Very excited to be back with you all tonight, especially on the eve of one of the most exciting sports days of the whole calendar year. Super Bowl number, I believe we're at 58 this year. So we've got obviously the Kansas City Chiefs going up against the San Francisco 49ers. The game is a rematch of just a couple years ago. These teams met up, but obviously, as we know in the NFL, with so much turnover, both in coaching staffs and rosters, these teams are very separate, very different from the ones that met a couple years ago. And although it is the excuse me, although it is the same quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs in Pat Mahomes, we obviously had a couple years ago with the Jimmy Garoppolo era was still going on in San Francisco. So this will be obviously one of those sort of the beast going up against the Padawan, if you will, the young player. So I'm excited to see how that works out. It's one of those was a season where a lot of people, including myself, I made the same mistake that I always made with Tom Brady, which was, I doubted him, I doubted his team, I doubted his defense, yada yada yada, and then of course he proved me wrong, and he's back in the freaking big game. So, congrats to the Kansas City Chiefs and Pat Mahomes, and of course, as a longtime Eagles fan, Coach Reed, our former coach over there. And then congratulations, obviously, to the San Francisco 49ers. Kyle Shanahan is now once again looking for his first ring, hoping to pick that up. And Brock Purdy doing the same, coming in as the last quarterback picked in the draft a couple of years ago. So it'll be really exciting to kind of see which style, which quarterback, and all of that wins out. Will it be the young coach looking to cut his teeth and win his first Super Bowl? Will it be the historic coach who's looking to potentially push Belichick as the GOAT? Will it be Pat Mahomes, who's coming in as perhaps again pushing Tom Brady for the GOAT? Will it be Brock Purdy coming in as Mr. Irrelevant a couple years ago, who had to fight through several players just to get the starting and keep the starting job? So very much looking forward to seeing how this all manifests and seeing how it shakes down. Potential significant loss on the offensive line for KC with Tooney not going to be available. So the team just brought up a new player, putting him on injured reserve. So you never know. It's looks like mostly these teams are going to be mostly healthy, but that is potentially a significant loss. And I think that's one of several examples why I expect this to be one of those heavily, especially early in the game, heavily power run oriented type Super Bowls. Obviously, I think we'll see a good amount from Mahomes, but I think particularly San Francisco is obviously going to lean heavily on the running game early, and they particularly, I think it's going to be important for them to come up with a lead early on, because not just because of their reliance on McCaffrey and company, but also the relative lack of experience and track record in these types of games from Brock Purdy compared to Pat Mahomes. He's obviously been there, done that. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that all comes together. But this is it was good to see, I think, for a lot of people, which I know it was mostly a meme, but I think it was good to see for a lot of people that this long-standing, I guess, whether you want to call it a meme, whether you want to call it a just a running joke or whatever it is, or if you actually sincerely did believe it, this whole it was rigged in favor of Baltimore and one thing or another. Hopefully that can be put to rest, although it did end up with perhaps the two teams that people thought it was going to be before the season started. So, but again, I think that the two best teams did make it, and as a football fan, I'm excited about that. So shifting off that for a second, because there are multiple other sports going on, then we'll come back to that in a little bit. But NBA this week had their trade deadline. I think it was, and I noticed this with the NBA particularly moreover than I think either of the other major sports in MLB or NFL or even NHL, although I haven't followed the trade deadline with that one quite as closely recently. I think it's fascinating to me how NBA in particular, the trade deadline seems to get very hyped, and it always seems to underwhelm in terms of what actually happens. Now, teams like the New York Knicks did have a solid deadline. They made that deal with Detroit, uh, Burks and company involved in that deal. I I think that the Knicks did well there, and I think that they are going to be a team that's going to be very strong in the East, the balance of the season. Detroit is just I was really surprised, honestly, because I know that they made several moves, but I thought that they were going to try and make even more. But one move I didn't expect them to make was move on from Killian Hayes, who was their first round pick just a couple years ago. So uh, just goes to show that now more than ever in sports, but especially in sports like the NBA, where you've only got a couple of years on your contract, not football where it's 4 years, or baseball where you've got 6 years of control and all of that. NBA, those deals are usually 2, 3 years max when you're drafted as a rookie. So, and the only player out of that rookie class who ended up being extended long term was Isaiah Stewart, their center, who I think I mentioned in the past. Actually, I was the manager for his high school team one season, so I'm glad to see him get that deal. I was curious to see because there was some reports that the Dallas Mavericks would try and trade for him. There was reports that my New Orleans Pelicans would try and trade for him, but no, I think that the Pistons they just had the owner come out and give sort of a vote of confidence to Troy Weaver. So I'll be interested to see if that holds on, or if that ends up being something that like we see what happens. They kind of use it down the road and say, "Oh, well, things changed since we made that statement." So, but no, NBA is rapidly coming on to going down the stretch here in the next several weeks, and the buyout market is starting to kick up now. There was reports about where Dinwiddie would go. There was speculation about teams like the LA Lakers, what they were going to do. There was I was watching the other day. Bob Myers was on. I don't know what show it was, but former Warriors executive Bob Myers was on, and he basically said the Lakers should do something, but they probably won't. And part of that is probably that they can't. And he was talking about sort of the two-headed monster when you have LeBron and he comes in there, and obviously he was the one behind the push for Anthony Davis, or at least was partly behind the push for Anthony Davis. I think a lot of people just have baked in the fact that wherever LeBron is, he has a major say in operations over there, whether you agree with that or not. That is the reality. And I think that right now they're kind of seeing some of the back end of that. Obviously, that they won their title a couple years ago with if you want to call it the COVID year or the bubble year, however you want to phrase it. But this season and going into the next couple years, it doesn't particularly look like they're going to have a significant level of competitiveness in the West when matched up with teams like the Denver Nuggets from last year, the Utah Jazz and other teams that have been, at least if not currently, at least have had recent history of being successful. Also, I hate to do this again, y'all, but just to be 100%, it's now about 10 minutes into the show, and I haven't seen any active comments, so I hope that that's not an issue yet again, but just letting y'all know that I'm not seeing anything so far. Excuse me. But so yeah, the NBA having in the next couple of weeks, now that those have happened, once they figure out who these buyouts are going to be and where these players are going to go, these rosters are more or less now pretty set between now and the playoffs. So, but of course, as we've seen, all it takes is a team to get hot at the right time. A couple of years ago, I don't think the Miami Heat. Oh, okay, cool. The comments are working. We got Jody Moncrief coming in just now saying, "Why did Denver extend MPJ for $175 million when he averages 16 and 4 rebounds?" I don't know. Maybe when I wasn't looking, the Colorado Rockies management took over the Denver Nuggets. I'm just kidding. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure there. I'm honestly been disappointed by some of what I've seen this season, because I thought that what they put together, obviously with not just Jokic but some of the guys around him, I thought that they were going to be a consistent force for the next couple years. Now it's obviously still time for them to finish strong, but I think where they're at right now is not. And then they just took that loss to the Kings. I don't know if that was yesterday or the day before, but they just took that loss to the Kings by it was like 30 points or something. So they have a good record still. Obviously, I'm not disputing the fact that they have a good record. There's still several games over 500 and one of the top teams, but I think that there are some fans who would have liked to see more coming out of them this season than what they've shown so far. So, although I will say at least they've not had a situation like the Milwaukee Bucks where they're coming out and they're firing their head coach and making everyone scratch their heads because, I just don't see Nikola Jokic as somebody who, well, I didn't see Giannis as one either. But I don't see Nikola Jokic at all as somebody who comes out and basically says, we have to move this guy out or we have to make this coaching move or I don't know. I feel like he just tries to do the best that he can with what he's got. At least that's the vibe that I get from him. And I personally think Jokic is the best player in the NBA. But I don't know. Obviously, for y'all's sake, I hope that the Denver Nuggets are able to finish strong and have a good strong in the postseason. But Jody says Denver bench is weak, no scoring. Yeah, and as we've seen the last couple of years, whether it's Miami, whether it's Milwaukee, whether it's Boston a couple years ago, whether it's the 76ers, who I think the last few years have been the biggest freaking frauds in the NBA, maybe in all of sports. There's always so much attention and media and whatnot that are on the 76ers, and I've not seen the level of success in big moments and in big times in the year that warrants that. I keep having people telling me that Joel Embiid is better than Nikola Jokic. I don't see the evidence of that. He's louder than Nikola Jokic, but I don't think those two necessarily have a strong correlation with one another. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. But I do agree with you, Jody. I think that once you have depth, and it's not just in basketball, we'll see it tomorrow with, I mentioned earlier about the injury to Tooney. We'll see how it happens on the exteriors of both offensive lines. I think are a little bit potentially ripe for being exploited by two very solid defensive lines, especially the ends. So I wouldn't be surprised if both defensive lines had an advantage going into tomorrow's game, which I think is going to aid in it becoming one of those, like I said earlier, one of those power games off the beginning. David Burns is back. I'm glad to see that. Good to see you back here from Cedar Hill, Texas. Hope you're doing well, David. Appreciate you coming back and joining in the show again. Jody says, do you like a minimum on how many games you must play to win MVP? I love it. I absolutely love it. I'm so glad they did this. I think that unfortunately it's still exploitable to an extent. So they may have to tweak it a little bit more, but I'm so glad to see this. The old thing in sports is the best ability is availability. I'm not interested in seeing somebody who scores 26 points a game for 50 games getting an award over somebody who scores 24 points a game but plays 30 more games. I'm not interested in the fact that you're able to, if everybody in the NBA was taking a day off every other game, I'm sure that their numbers would be better too. So yeah, the whole load management, like, Kawhi Leonard, who I used to love, but I think the whole load management is a load of BS, and I don't think that there's, it goes back to, may he rest in peace. Go back to, Kobe Bryant. And there was I don't remember where the speech was being given, but his wife was giving a speech regarding, was giving a speech kind of honoring Kobe, and basically, and I'm gonna paraphrase her here, said, Kobe never wanted to disappoint his fans. He said, I'm not gonna, sit a game out when the guys up there in the 300 levels are coming to see us play and see us win, and this may be their one shot to do it, so I have a ton of respect for that. I wish that mentality were more prevalent. Reminds me a little bit of, to cross over into MLB for a second, reminds me a little bit of that discussion I had about Anthony Rendon a couple of weeks ago, that there was that beef between Rendon and former Phillies closer Jonathan Papelbon, who basically Rendon was saying, the seasons are too long, we don't want to play this many games, et cetera, et cetera. And Papelbon basically clapped back at him and said, you're making $200 million and you're arguing to play less baseball, which frankly I agree with him on that point. So yeah, Jody, I think that they may have to do a little bit better on some of the because there's gonna be ways to work around it and exploit it, and I think that the league's probably gonna try and adjust it to prevent some of that. I don't know how close to perfect you can get it, but yes, I absolutely love what they're doing there, and my respect to Adam Silver and company on that one. David Burns says it's all about showing up and showing out. Yep, absolutely, completely agree. It's like I said in whether it's NFL, MLB, NBA, if you're playing 60% of the games in the season, I'm not interested in the fact that you had a slightly better averages than this guy who played 20 or 30 more games than you, because again, had he taken that many games off, maybe his averages would be there's a good argument that his averages would likely be higher as well. So yeah, not a huge fan of that at all. Appreciate the question, Jody. But speaking of which, as I mentioned earlier, spring training is just a couple weeks away. One of the things that surprises me, and I know that this has been talked about throughout MLB media, but I want to address it here. A couple years ago, when MLB, this was in 2021, and when MLB had that whole lockout saga that lasted, it ended up delaying the first couple games of MLB season and truncating the season, which there were fewer rest days because of the shortened season and whatnot. That was understandable that year as to why free agency went the way that it did, because obviously you couldn't make deals for several months. But this year, you've got some really, really talented, productive, just solid players out there available, whether it's free agency or the trade market, but specifically I want to focus on free agency. And I'm just really surprised by that, honestly, because there's been a couple times in recent years where you can kind of make sense as to why either it was like one or two guys were holding the whole market up, or the lockout, as I mentioned. This year, I'm racking my brain to try and figure out exactly why this is happening, but I can't remember many seasons in recent memory where you go into what's going to be the second half of February, spring training starting in, I think, 2 weeks, and the amount of guys are still available that we are currently looking at, and the amount of highly talented guys are still available that we're currently looking at. So I think what you'll probably see, I think, over the next couple weeks, it may bleed a little bit into spring training, but I can't imagine it goes too far into that. I think that this is where players and agents are going to lose a little bit of leverage, is because it's just generally known that players don't want to have a shortened spring training that's, they don't get to warm themselves up, to the fullest extent. They have to ramp up quicker. There's a higher risk for injury, all of that. So I think that there's some risk for the players involved in that, and I think that some teams might try and capitalize on that. Obviously, for the Boras type clients and whatnot, they may just say, hey, if you want to take the risk on not having this position addressed at the start of the season, then so be it. But I do think that I'll be curious to see if that does come back to hurt some players' potential earning power, because guys, we talked about in the last couple of shows, we've talked about Cody Bellinger. That sort of wild card elephant in the room is, what happens with Trevor Bauer, starting pitcher. Matt Chapman is a name that keeps getting brought up as to what's going to go on with him. So I think that, but even guys who are not necessarily that sort of top of line player, but still very talented, guys like Tim Anderson, guys, pardon me, Whit Merrifield is a player that I think is pretty underrated. And then obviously we haven't even talked about pitching. So I think that there's, and that could be actually a side that gets even more, has even more of an impact of what I said earlier with regard to not being able to stretch out and do their normal routine and whatnot. Because a couple of years ago, when they had the truncated spring training, we saw a good number of injuries out of the gate, particularly on the pitching side. So I'm curious to follow what happens there. But, excuse me, the teams involved with these players hasn't really changed from what I've heard. There hasn't really been a sort of a late entry that I've heard on Bellinger or Chapman or Montgomery or any of those guys. Bellinger, the go away feeling has been that he'll ultimately return to Chicago. Montgomery, I think that there's still a solid belief that he'll end up back in Texas. I know that New York was interested in him, but that didn't come together, and I think that's part of how they ended up with Stroman. Boston, I know, was interested in him. I'm not aware that that's still ongoing. So these markets, to my understanding, haven't changed a whole heck of a lot recently. Another player who's not on the free agent market, but I'll be curious to see what happens now, is Devin Williams. He was the late inning reliever for Milwaukee a couple years ago, or last year, sorry, after they traded Hader a couple years ago. And he's somebody who I think if you're a team like the Yankees, or if you're a team like, I would have said probably Houston before they went out and got Hader. Some of these teams that are still looking for bullpen help, that might be a place that you're turning to now. Now that Hader's off the board, now that Maton and some of these other guys have been put in different positions, either via trade or free agency. So I'm curious to see what happens with him. I remember going back to when he either was still a prospect in the minors or he had just come to the major leagues, and there was a breakdown comping him with Justin Verlander, just in terms of his mechanics and his pitch tunnel and all of that, and his consistency and his repetition of his delivery. And they were talking about how he could become a truly dominant reliever if it didn't work out for him as a starter, and that appears to be what's happening. So I am curious to see what happens this year, because I do think he gets moved unless Milwaukee suddenly has significant belief in, but I have a hard time, especially after Corbin Burnes was traded. I think it's even more likely now that Williams will get moved, and I'm curious as to where that'll be. If I would hope that New York gets involved in that, because I heard earlier that they were in on Hader, and didn't make it happen. He went to Houston, which great, another player that New York wanted that ended up in Houston, just lovely. But yeah, so not a ton more has actually transpired on that front. Although it was interesting to see a couple days ago, for those of you who missed it, the Major League Baseball suspended for the season former New York Mets GM Billy Epler, who also was the former GM for the Anaheim Angels and the former assistant GM for the New York Yankees under Brian Cashman. So Epler was suspended because of, and this is kind of like the sign stealing thing, but I think to a much lesser extent, obviously, where there's been this sort of, I don't know how you'd phrase it, but this sort of understanding that this is going on, and it's like, just keep it to a reasonable level, or if it gets beyond that, you're going to get dinged for it. And I think that's what we saw with Brian Epler, is that he kind of got scapegoated here, because even Ken Rosenthal is known as somebody who, dots his I's, crosses his T's. He does not put anything out until he's got 101% confirmation and 100% belief behind it, which obviously I have a lot of respect for that. But he said a couple of days ago that if you think that this started and ended with Billy Epler and or the New York Mets, you're fooling yourself. That this is a practice that spreads throughout most, if not all, 30 MLB clubs, in terms of manipulating the injured list, and basically players going on with sort of phantom injuries, or sort of getting placed on for, let's say, an injury that might take 2 or 3 days, gets put on the 10-day IL, so they have this, don't have to worry about the roster spot, one thing or another. So this is sort of a practice that's been, I guess, behind the scenes for a decent amount of time now. And, Rosenthal himself basically said, you're fooling yourself if you don't think that this is pretty ubiquitous. So it was a little disappointing to see Billy Epler get made an example of, especially to the extent that he lost a full season. That's about the same penalty that was given to AJ Hinch, that was given to Alex Cora, and a couple of the other guys affiliated with the Houston scandal, which I think is pretty universally considered to be more significant than this. I'm not knocking Houston. I'm just saying that to put him on a 1-year suspension, which is the same thing that these other people got. I think that they threw the book at him excessively, in my opinion. Um, but again, I understand that someone has to take the fall for it, and maybe Major League Baseball looked at it and said, well, he's not going to be a GM this year anyway, so without having to take out someone who's currently employed in one of those positions, we can basically come down and say you're going to get penalized for this if you do it, but also not affect one of the 30 clubs that's actually competing and not put one of them in a position where they have to make these last minute plans that they didn't expect to have to make. So that could be part of the angle here in terms of how Major League Baseball went about this, and in terms of why they came down on Epler the way that they did, now that he's not in a position of um, having a general manager spot right now. But I'm not 100% sure. But I would be surprised if this is something that I'd be surprised if this were a penalty that was universally looked at and said, yeah, that seems about right. I think that there's going to be some pushback on this. So started talking about the Super Bowl. Now that we've got some new people in here, I'm going to jump back and talk about that a little bit more. So just looking at the breakdown, I've got Pro Football Focus up right now in terms of looking at their preview. I highly recommend their website for just game metrics, for player evaluations, especially for prospect content. I do a ton of prospect research through them, excuse me. And I think that they've got a lot of people who are really in tune with how players are evaluated these days. So I highly recommend them if you are looking for that type of content. Right now, it says that the 1.5 point favorites are the 49ers, which, excuse me, kind of a little bit surprising to me. I know obviously there's no real home field advantage in the Super Bowl, but just the fact that San Francisco has never won the Super Bowl, and Kansas City has the players that we talked about before. Not knocking the players that San Francisco has, obviously. I guess I just kind of had a gut feeling that Kansas City would have the favorite going into the game, but that's not the case. It's 1.5 point for San Francisco, and as we talked about before, the only player who's not really who's kind of up in the air right now, at least according to when the last updates came in, was McKinnon, the halfback for Kansas City, is listed as questionable. Everybody else is either already determined on IR or to be out in cases of Verrett and Hawkins for San Francisco. So, I think that it's going to be. I think pretty much all the eyes are going to be on Brock Purdy, Mahomes and Reed and those guys, Kelsey and company. They've been there, done that. They've proven themselves. They know that this is they know what this is about. And San Francisco obviously has played in these games. A lot of these players have played in these games the last couple of years, either for San Francisco or other teams. Purdy has not. So seeing what he's able to do when he's going toe-to-toe with Mahomes, when he's going up against a coach like Andy Reid, when he's faced with, I think, a significantly better defense in Kansas City than what they had when they were last in the Super Bowl against the 49ers. Even, I think, better than what they had last year when they were facing the Eagles in the Super Bowl. I think that the next couple of the first couple of drives, I think, is where you're going to have to see, does Purdy come out? Does he look fluid? Does he look like he's able to, does he have the poise? Does he look rusty at all? Because even the last couple of weeks, he hasn't looked as crisp as you would like to see for a young quarterback going up into the Super Bowl against, again, arguably one of the 2 or 3 greatest quarterbacks of all time. So I think you'll probably see them rely more heavily on, obviously we talked about McCaffrey, but rely also on Kittle and some of their ability to rely on their depth and their power in the trenches. I'm not 100% sure if I am as concerned about Purdy in this game as some people are. but I do think that it's a situation where he's never been in stakes this high. He looks like he's able to handle some of it from some of what we've seen in the big games before, but his production the last couple of weeks does have people concerned. So he's going to have to quiet that early in order to make sure that the momentum doesn't go to KC early. Because obviously, as most people know, if KC gets momentum, they very rarely lose it. Even with this season, where in the beginning, at least until the last couple of weeks, we thought we were dealing with a bit of a end of the road KC dynasty, and does not appear that that's anything of the case with what we've seen the last couple of weeks, and especially with some of how we've seen the fourth quarters go with when Pat Mahomes gets the ball back in his hands. So one thing that I'll be curious about with shifting off of this, but just going to in general, the NFL scope in general, we've seen the coaching staffs, have been locked up. We just saw the last couple of coordinators. We saw 8 new head coaches and about half the league replacing either an offensive or defensive coordinator or both. So that tracks right around with what the average numbers are in terms of how much turnover there is in the league on a year-to-year basis. But I keep going back to not just Belichick, but Mike Vrabel, those types of names. I'm curious to see what happens with him in particular. I know that all the eyes are on Belichick, but I think seeing what happens with Vrabel going into the next season, I think that I wouldn't be surprised if when a team needs a coach, if they go and let's say a team goes out, whether maybe it's the Jets, maybe it's Philly, Dallas, wherever. I wouldn't be surprised if one of these teams makes a move midseason. I would be a little bit more surprised if it were Philly, just because they typically don't make moves midseason. But a team like the Jets or the Cowboys, if they went out and made a move midseason, I wouldn't be surprised if Vrabel was their first call more so than Belichick. Just because, again, I think that there's a certain level of what he's done in the past couple of years. He's had a decent amount to work with at times, referring to Vrabel here. And then the GM, whether it's the current one or the previous one, I'm blanking on their names right now, but the GMs in Tennessee have consistently been kind of moving parts out, bringing parts in. There's been a lot of turnover. Obviously, like I said, they went out and got Will Levis at quarterback, who I'm not a fan of. But even when they had Tannehill, they moved off A.J. Brown. They moved off, they brought in Jones and they moved off him. They've had this sort of revolving door of weapons the last few years. But in contrast to New England, Belichick is a lot of the reason for that, or was a lot of the reason for that in New England, as opposed to in Tennessee. He mostly was having to work with what he was given. Now, I know he had more power in Tennessee than a lot of coaches do, and a lot of people believe. But my understanding is at least a good amount of the personnel was still, he was still working with a lot of what was given to him. So I'd be curious, and I would also be curious about that as well, is if and when Vrabel and or Belichick start getting these calls for these new coaching jobs, how much are they willing to relinquish control in order to say, yeah, I'll come, coach for you. But I'll just focus on coaching. I won't be, demanding to have roster control, or I won't be trying to have, draft control or 53 man or, all of this. So I'd be curious to see if and when one of those two or both gets jobs, how much of a factor that becomes, and how much they're willing to accept having to let someone else handle the non-game day aspects of things and the off-field aspects of things, I guess you'd say. Pardon me. And then going back, I started talking about NBA a little bit earlier. There was discussion the last couple of days about, I mentioned some of the moves earlier, and I know Kurt had brought up, actually, we just talked about Spencer Dinwiddie. So the signing just became official. The Lakers did sign Spencer Dinwiddie, as I mentioned earlier. Dinwiddie was traded from the Brooklyn Nets. He was there in his second stint, and then got moved over to the Toronto Raptors, who cut him pretty much immediately. Rob Pelinka had come out and said that the Lakers were looking for a guard with good ball handling skills on the buyout market. Other teams, I mentioned the Mavericks earlier regarding the Isaiah Stewart talks, but the Mavericks, the Sixers, the New Orleans Pelicans were all listed as factors in the Dinwiddie buyout market. There were reports that the Dallas Mavericks were probably the main team that was competing with LA to sign him. Obviously, as we see, we just saw him go to LA. So even though they weren't able to, like I went back to the Bob Myers quote the other day, even though they didn't really have the flexibility to do much of anything prior to the trade deadline, it looks like they were able to make this move happen. So we'll see how that manifests and how that impacts their team on the court coming down the line. Excuse me. I want to go back to this because I was going to mention this earlier, and I wanted to move on to something else real quick. But going back to Major League Baseball, there's been a lot of issues the last couple of years. We talked about Corbin Burnes had that whole arbitration issue. Ultimately, saw him getting moved to the Baltimore Orioles a couple weeks ago. Nick Gordon for the Minnesota Twins just lost his arbitration hearing as well. Now, Gordon hasn't built up the level of he doesn't have the level of, I guess you'd say, stardom that and the level of career production over a period of time that Corbin Burnes does. Burnes being a starting pitcher also, and Gordon being a utility man. But I am curious to see going forward how these types of deals and these type of situations affect how these players and teams, does it lead to more trade requests because we've been seeing players become more and more comfortable with making those types of demands, whether or not they've reached this, because that used to be something that was, more for a star potential type of player. And now we've seen pretty much, anybody is potentially going to be in position to ask for a trade if they want one. So, but Nick Gordon was someone who came on after being drafted in 2014. And he, before this past season, he pretty much lost the entire year. He had a significant season coming out in 2022 where he really popped onto the scene. So I don't think that he'll have any issues going forward as long as he stays healthy with, the contracts that he'll get. But I am curious if this, going back to the New York Yankees rather, with Dellin Betances a few years ago, that was another situation where there was a dispute during arbitration there. And there was a lot of belief that along with Yankee president Randy Levine's subsequent comments, that those two things played a heavy role in why Dellin Betances did not return to New York when he hit free agency. So, excuse me. But that whole process, just in terms of as players get more and more empowerment, as there becomes more and more leverage by players and by the Players Association, just curious to see how that continues to affect relationships, I guess you'd say, between both teams and players, both as free agents, but also existing contracts and existing team player relationships. Because we've seen those things get pretty contentious at times. Corbin Burnes, as I mentioned, his was pretty infamously not well received and led to some pretty public comments on both sides, both critical of Burnes and critical of Brewers owner Mark Attanasio. So different aspects of that situation can potentially rear their ugly head later on and resurface even months or years down the road. So potentially something to keep an eye on for the Minnesota Twins. But for now, they do have him under contract for this year for $900,000 is the amount that was decided on by the arbiter. So going back, we were talking, I'll circle back to the Super Bowl going into tomorrow. Think that there's I keep going back to that line that was put up in terms of betting, and a lot of years there was a strong rooting interest that I personally will have in one game or another, or one team or another in the Super Bowl this year. I mean, I would love it if both teams could lose. To be honest with you, not a San Francisco 49er fan at all, and have not positive things to say about some of the other side of things with the Kansas City Chiefs organization. Just not something that I would see myself rooting for them. So I'm curious to see. Maybe I'll to channel Joey Clams here. Shout out to Joey Clams. Hope you're doing well. If you get a chance to listen to this, buddy, maybe I'll throw a little pizza money on something at halftime. Get a little one of those things going. Maybe I don't do the parlays. If you do the parlays, I don't do that because with my luck, I would have 4 legs of a 5-leg parlay hit, not cash out, thinking, oh, I just got to get one more to hit. That one doesn't hit, and then I freaking lose everything. So, not something. If you're ballsy enough to do the parlay thing, God bless you. It's not something that I could see myself doing. I still remember back to. I'll tell a story real quick about this since I brought up sports betting. Going back a few years ago, it was talking to a buddy of mine who wanted to make a bet on basketball, and this guy wasn't a basketball fan, wasn't an NBA fan. I don't know if he could name 5 players outside of LeBron. And we were hanging out, and he was like, "I'm going to go and do this." I'm like, "You?" And I asked, "What game are you going to bet?" And he was going to bet a Warriors game, but it was a Warriors game in which it was one of the games where the Warriors were like favored by double-digit points or something like that, just something outrageous. And I said, "You're going to bet them to cover?" It's like, "No, I'm going to bet them outright." I was like, "You're out of your mind. What do you?" But if you, in my mind, I'm like, "All right, if you want to, piss your money away, then go for it." But and then I sit back and I'm watching or I'm following the game on my phone just to see like, okay, how bad does this get for this guy? And it was the one game in that series that the Warriors lost. And to this day, I mean, this was a couple years ago now, and to this day, whenever he and I talk basketball, like I get so irritated thinking about like just the dumb luck that this guy has. If you're watching this, shout out to my buddy Michael Marciano. I hope you're doing well, bud. Um, yeah, no, I'm not a huge sports betting guy outside of football. I tried to get into betting baseball a couple years ago when I was first eligible. When it first the my age and my location first legally allowed me to do so is the best way I can put it. And I put up, I don't even remember if it was DraftKings, FanDuel, whatever it was, but I put up a couple of just very small bets on MLB games. I don't even remember exactly what they were. I don't know if they were line bets. I don't know if they were outright bets. I don't remember much of the details. But I think I bet like 4 or 5 times in a row in the span of like 2 weeks, and I lost every single one. And I'm like, okay, I'm never doing this again. I'm not gonna keep making those mistakes. So yeah, I don't know how people do so well on betting baseball or betting basketball. It's not something that I have a lot of um, not even a lot of understanding of, much less success with. So respect to you guys who do engage in that. But just a fun story there that I thought of as I was talking about sports betting. Jody Moncrief has a question saying, "Where is Snell, Montgomery, and Bowers going to pitch this season?" So Montgomery, I'm gonna stick with my gut feeling that he's gonna go back to Texas. Again, I just don't see Boston as the fit there. And I think if he were going to go to a place like the Yankees, he would have by now. And there hasn't really been a ton of strong connections to any other team besides those 3. Blake Snell, because it's tough because when you're looking at him, you got to think of, excuse me, um, people are, and again, I understand why people don't bring it up as much, the control stuff, because again, it hasn't come back to hurt him really to this point. But it sticks in the back of my mind whenever I think of him, wherever he would go. So I can see him going to a team where maybe the pressure's not on him to necessarily be the number one. Um, and he's pitched well in smaller markets in the past. I could potentially, if Minnesota wants to put somebody out there to match along with what's his name, Pablo Lopez. We've seen them being willing to spend the big money in the past when they made that deal for Correa, when they made a couple of other moves. So they've been willing to spend the big money at times. So that's an underrated fit I could potentially see. Uh, the problem that I have is that a lot of these up and coming teams who should be in the market for starting pitching are just teams that you don't see spending the big money. The Baltimore Orioles, I almost said Kansas City, the Cincinnati Reds. Um, you know, Kansas City's made a bit of a push that I respect this offseason, but I don't think they're at the point yet which I don't think they would to begin with, but I don't think that they're even at the point where they should consider, a contract like that. So yeah, I would probably say, and then perhaps the one fit that I could look at as outside of Minnesota, maybe one of the teams that's been in the World Series the last couple of years, but hasn't won it, maybe an Arizona or Philadelphia type. Dave Dombrowski is always somebody who's willing to spend big money. So I think of those two teams, maybe the Phillies in particular, I could see. The Phillies are, excuse me, I don't know. The Phillies have been surprisingly not in on some of the guys that I thought they'd be in on, but I wouldn't be surprised if they come off the board with one of these top players in the next few weeks, just because it doesn't seem to really be in their DNA, especially getting so close as they have recently. Doesn't really seem to me to be in their DNA to just suddenly not spend at the top of the market, especially when you've gotten that close. Excuse me. And then Trevor Bauer, excuse me. I was actually asking, I got a group chat with a bunch of Yankees fans from college, and I was asking a couple days ago, point blank, in the aftermath of what came together this offseason regarding his off-field stuff, would you make a move to bring in Trevor Bauer? Because right now, just whatever you want to say about, whether you think that, he's exonerated now because of the off-field stuff, whether you think, it still has a scarlet letter on him because there's still, he was cleared in this way, but, one thing or another, regardless of how you look at it, if you just look at it from a pure baseball standpoint, he is probably, if you ask me to list of the pitchers right now who are available for acquisition, he probably is the best available pitcher, in my opinion. And if he's not, he's right up there with Jordan Montgomery. And I'm talking about like guys who I'm not mentioning like the Dylan Cease type, like the guys who could be traded, but it seems like a long shot right now. I'm talking about guys who have a very realistic chance of being on another team in the next few weeks. I think he might very well be the best available pitcher. I said before, I think the Yankees should go after him because, again, the Yankees had said they wanted to go after at least 2 arms. Now, they brought in Stroman, and they kind of left it open as to whether they wanted to bring in another team or another arm, which would whether it was be bullpen or starting pitcher. But the arms that they kept being connected to for the bullpen, whether it was Maton, whether it was Hader, whether it was my name's blanking on the other guy. I know Stevenson was one, but for some reason I can't think of the other one. But there was a lot of or not really a lot of clarity as to what they were emphasizing on. I would probably say, and I said before that I would probably emphasize the bullpen, but I do think New York should take a serious look at him. But I think that I could see it being a situation where there's a thank you, Jody. Hector Neris. That's who I was thinking of. Jody said from the Astros, and yes, that tipped me to remember it was Hector Neris. Excuse me, but yeah, I think that what I could possibly see a team doing is if there's a team that is a smaller market team, because he's pitched in Cleveland, he's pitched in Cincinnati. If there's a smaller market team that could potentially think, we'll either bring him in and we'll hope to make a surprise run, or if not, we'll flip him at the deadline to a contender. I could see a team potentially doing that. But I said before that I think New York is a fit there, and I maintain that I think that that would probably be my best fit. Although speaking of New York, the New York Mets are still, they still haven't really successfully replaced the pitchers that they have lost the last couple of years. Some of the top guys that they lost, whether that was um, Verlander, whether that was Scherzer, whether that was Degrom. So, and they were the team with whom the Bauer had an agreement when this all first came to light, and they ended up reneging on it, and that's how we ended up in LA. So, I think that could be an interesting fit too as well. I don't remember I don't remember what parts of the current regime, the Cohen regime, were there when they worked on that deal. But that's another team I could see coming together and making a push for him if they still have interest, and if the same people who were behind pursuing him prior are still there and still interested in doing that, because they do have a significant need at pitching. And I think that Steve Cohen also. Now, I'm a big fan of Steve Cohen. I'm a huge fan of just his mentality. I'm a fan of he's, a longtime Mets fan. He's, actually putting resources, he's putting his money where his mouth is, all of that. But it just hasn't translated to consistent results on the field yet. So I think that the Mets are going to be feeling some pressure this year and feeling some push this year to go out and make a couple of moves like that. So that could be a move that allows them to get a little bit stealthy and go out and bring somebody in who maybe ordinarily not that they wouldn't have a chance to get, but they'd have a lot more competition for. Star saying hello. How you doing, Star? Welcome to the show. Glad you're joining us via YouTube. It looks like. Hope that hope you've been enjoying the show, and feel free to comment and chime in with a question if you've got one. Jody, what do you expect from DeGrom this year? DeGrom is one of DeGrom and Trout are kind of, in my mind, very similar situations, because they should be all-time greats at their positions, but their injuries, especially toward the middle to latter parts of their careers, are going to prevent them from getting the career totals and the accumulation of stats that they deserve and that they are capable of. So I think that's it came out a couple of weeks ago that Scherzer is supposed to be out until around midsummer, and DeGrom is as well. So what I wouldn't be surprised to see is Texas kind of maybe not playing it too aggressively in the beginning of the season, and maybe doing that sort of mentality where they're treating getting those two guys back as deadline additions type of thing, because they don't have a ton of capital to go out and just keep adding. Now, granted, you're the defending World Series champion, so how much do you need to really add in the first place? But if you are of the mentality, which it seems like they are, that you always keep trying to add, or at least you always keep trying to improve, then I could see them kind of treating those as like their potential deadline acquisitions in the event they're not able to go out and get somebody else, because again, their ability to make certain moves, I think, was limited a little bit by some of the trades and free agent moves that they made, which, again, they got a ring. I'm not saying anything against it, because they did what you're supposed to do. They put whatever the resources they could into winning a title, and then they won it. So I'm not saying anything. I'm not begrudging them. I'm not saying anything critical of them, but that wouldn't be surprising, because my understanding is that neither Scherzer nor Verlander is expected back before probably around the All-Star break, if not later. Did I like the Altuve deal? Yeah, absolutely. I think that you guys really, I'm honestly surprised that you guys kept him at the price that you did. It was, I believe, 5 for $125, if I remember correctly. But no, I mean, he is pretty much the face of the Astros. I think a lot of people look at him not just as the face of what they've been able to accomplish in the postseason. The fact that in several years where their roster has changed and they've had different guys on different playoff runs. He's been one of the consistent faces along with Bregman and company. I think that there's definitely something bigger than baseball. I think it's sort of his. Again, I'm not. I can't put anyone on the level of Jeter with the Yankees or something like that. But I think that's the type of connection between city, team, and player that you kind of see with Altuve in Houston. Down to the fact where their mayor designated the seventh as, or I think it was no, was it the seventh or the second? I'm having a mental block now. But they designated it as Jose Altuve Day, which I'm not gonna lie, I did think was kind of cool, and I wouldn't be surprised if they actually negotiated and finalized and all of that the deal in the way that they did, so that it could be they could have that on that specific day, which I think was just really smart and really cool. So yeah, I've got a lot of a lot of good things to say about that contract, and I think also Altuve is just a guy that people love to root for. Again, I'm going to disconnect from, all the, the elephants in the room. I think a lot of people just love to root for somebody who, obviously he's 5'6". He could, look me in the eye. He has the story of when he went and he showed up for, I think it was still Houston, but he showed up for like either a camp or a tryout or something. And he basically was told, we're not going to have you back. And he came back anyway, and they ultimately ended up signing him. So again, ton of respect in that regard. I think that think it's good for Houston and the Astros and Altuve. I think it's a win all around. I think, and frankly, I think it is good for baseball. I think baseball having some of these, I don't necessarily want to call them villains, but some of these teams that generate a certain amount of lightning rod, if you want to call it. Like, the Yankees were that for a while. It sounds like, or it seems like, and I think LA will probably be that in the NL, just because they've been out and spent a bleep ton of money this offseason, although I don't have a problem with any of it. I think it's a little bit, I could have a little bit of an issue with the structuring of the contracts, depending on how the league decides to handle that. But again, that's that's the type of thing where a lot of the fans, including myself, who maybe have something to say about it, would think that their team were geniuses if they were the one that came up with it. So just have to be objective from that standpoint. Surprise team and team that will fall off this season. Excuse me. The problem that I have with answering that is just like I said earlier, there's so many free agents and trade players that haven't gotten to their new positions yet. So that's the one area that I kind of, or the one reason that I kind of struggle with answering that question. But excuse me. Team that I think will surprise this season, I'll probably go with the Kansas City Royals. I keep talking about how much I like what they did this offseason. I don't think they're going to be a playoff team, but I think that, I think they're going to improve from losing what I think was 106 games last year. So Kansas City, I think, is going to be my team that's going to, if I had to guess, probably be the team that would be improving. Team that I think is going to regress somewhat. Milwaukee is an obvious one for me, just because, like I said, they lost Corbin Burns. They look like they're going to be trading Devin Williams. It's just that they're breaking it down, which, again, don't really love the way that they've gone through that process. I don't think that Attanasio is handling it the way that I would have. And I know he's generating a lot of consternation from fans, which I think is 100% validated. So Milwaukee would probably be one team, but that kind of feels a little bit like low-hanging fruit just based on the position that they're in. I think Philadelphia is another team that could be, because, again, I mentioned them earlier as a team that I think needs to do more, especially if they want to get back to the World Series and, this time be able to win it. But like I said, the NL, the Atlanta Braves are not going anywhere. The LA Dodgers are, as stacked as any roster has been in recent memory. The NL is not going to be, the Marlins look like they started to get some things together over the past couple of years in one way or another. Although I think that letting Kim Ng go was a monumental mistake on their end. So now that things are mostly back in the hands of Bruce Sherman, um, that actually leads me to perhaps the Miami Marlins might be the third team there, just because again the two people who were really running that operation that I really liked were Kim Ng and Derek Jeter in the GM and CEO positions respectively, and now they've both left. But it's not just the fact that they've left; it's the circumstances under which they've left, which is basically a um, difference in philosophy and a sort of a split in team building approach that they have with Bruce Sherman, which I'm sorry, I'm going to take Kim Ng and the business and baseball knowledge of Derek Jeter over Bruce Sherman, who hadn't won a damn thing. So I don't think that there's a lot of optimism for me that this is suddenly going to make things better. I know that they brought in Peter Bendix from Tampa Bay, who is definitely well regarded as an executive, but even bringing in someone like that when two of your highest ranking executives leave under those circumstances and under those conditions, um, I don't think that bodes particularly well. So yeah, I know you asked for one team, I gave you three, but those are the three teams that I would say. I would say the Brewers, the Phillies, and the Marlins are teams that I think could fall off, and the team that I think could surprise would be the Kansas City Royals, which also for all the baseball fans listening right now. Um, Highly recommend if you get a chance to and you haven't seen it and haven't been there. Highly recommend going out to Kansas City and taking in a game at Kauffman Stadium. I know the Royals have not been a good team, but the baseball experience that I had there when I went to the game against the Yankees at the end of the season rivals any baseball, like specific just game day experience, rivals any game day experience that I've had. So highly recommend going out there and going to that stadium if you get the chance and if you haven't already. That being said, seeing no further comments and seeing that is up on the buzzer right now, I'm going to say that I think I'm going to wrap it up for now. But thank you again. You got a lot of interaction with my guy Jody tonight. I appreciate that. David Burns, thank you for coming back on the show. Star, thanks for chiming in on YouTube. Before I go, just want to make a little bit of a brief statement. First and foremost, obviously, want to shout out all the shows every week on K&K. Everyone does, from the Giants show to the Kurt's Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern time, Denver Let's Talk Broncos, the New Jersey high school sports that he and his wife Jen do all week. A ton of great content coming out. And then, of course, our brothers at the Rocky Mountain Sports Network have incredible work on not just Broncos, but Nuggets and some new initiatives coming out soon with the Colorado Rockies. So highly recommend that. The Denver Bronco Roundup show on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sundays. Actually, Jody, correct me if it's Thursdays or Fridays. I think it actually is Fridays. My apologies. At 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. Central Time. And on that note, I will actually be a guest on Denver Bronco Roundup on Tuesday night. So I hope you'll tune in to frequent shows over there. But I hope you'll tune in as I get a chance to go on there for the first time and get a chance to talk about the first couple days of the offseason and what lies ahead for one of always the most interesting teams in the NFL. So appreciate the Denver Bronco Roundup guys for inviting me on. Looking forward to being there with Keith, Trevor, and everybody. Thanks again, and I'll see y'all on air that night, Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll be back on next week for What's the Scoop? Same scoop time, same scoop channel. Good night, y'all.